Hi, I'm Steve Moriarty from Moriarty's Gem Art, and welcome back to part 2 of how to cut colored gems. Today we're going to show you the material that we're going to cut during these lessons on cutting. And what I have are a piece of citrine from Uruguay, kind of flat, bit of regular shape, and a piece of garnet. And this comes from Tanzania. It's a beautiful color, and a fairly big stone. It's should cut a 10 carat size stone. So what we've got planned for these, because these two stones use the two different types of polishing that I do. This will be polished on the bat lap, and this will be polished using the spectra laps and cerium oxide. So once you have your piece of rough, the first thing you have to determine is, are there any inclusions in it that'll cause problems during cutting? So I always use the refractol. This material has a refractive index very similar to quartz, so when you put quartz in here, the surface is going to pretty much disappear and you'll see everything that's in it. As far as the garnet goes, the garnet has much higher refractive index. It's still very helpful to see into it, but there's other materials like methylene iodide that has a much higher refractive index. But the problem with it, it's very expensive and somewhat caustic and bad to breathe. So the refractol is real helpful on seeing inside stones, and I recommend that you use it on every stone you do. So a couple of ways of doing it. I mean, if you look at the citrine in there, I mean, the surface of the stone has pretty much disappeared. It looks like a piece of jelly within the fluid, and that's because the refractive index, or how it bends light, is almost exactly the same. So you can pretty much look into it, see where the inclusions are, and then you have to try and work around these. You can leave some inclusions in depending on where they're at and the shape of them or how they're oriented, and sometimes it's difficult to see, but it's always best to cut a nice clean stone, which I think this one will cut completely clean. So two ways of using refractol: you can use it in a glass jar like this, or you can just pretty much coat the stone, and even out of the jar it's fairly easy to see inside the stone. You can either use a light like this, or you can use a flashlight. It's very helpful in identifying the inclusions. So now when we do the garnet, you'll see it's a little more difficult to see into because the refractive index is quite a bit different. This being 1.57 and this garnet somewhere around 1.74, but still helpful. You know, you can still see into the gem better than you can without it. And again, you can just coat the stone, and it's still quite helpful in seeing into the stone. And this is another piece that's very clean, which makes it a lot easier to determine what to cut from. You don't have to worry about working around inclusions. You know, I also recommend, in general, using a visor. Visor is going to help. That extra magnification makes it much easier to see into the stone. Looking at this piece of rough, I've determined I'm going to cut a round brilliant out of it. It's fairly shallow. It's 9 millimeters deep, and currently it's about 16 millimeters round. In a round brilliant, I can expect maybe I'll need about 70% depth in relation to width. So 70 times 13 is somewhere around 9 millimeters. So with luck, I'll get about a 13 millimeter, maybe down to 12 millimeter out of this stone because of its shallow depth. We've determined that it is a clean stone, so I don't have to worry about any inclusions. I look for the shallowest part of the stone, which is over here, which this material is not going to be very useful. So I'm going to start preforming by cutting it at the thinnest point, because I've got to make it thicker. There's got to be a girdle, there's got to be some crown above it, there's got to be pavilion below it. So I'll start cutting away, get the water running. You know, the key is getting rid of what you know you can't use. So as you're preforming, you get rid of the material that you know is useless, whether it's because of inclusions or it's too thin. And then ultimately you can decide what you're really going to cut out of the stone, which often changes. So on this side, I've pretty much probably close to where the girdle will be. So I can start working on the other parts. There's a little point here and around. I'm sure not going to need a point. This side is thick enough. I don't have to worry too much about it. So I'm getting closer to round. So this is a 180 lap I'm working on. The bigger the stone, the more material you have to work with, the coarser the lap that you use. So I've got a point down here that's kind of straight up and down. I can cut it in to kind of match where the pavilion's going to be. Getting much closer to round. And I'm currently at 15 millimeters, so I know I have another 2 millimeters that I can cut away without risking losing material, because I know my depth is only going to allow me 12 to 15 millimeter stone. So now I can, you don't have to cut it all the way down. Now I do have to make a position for the table and where I'm going to dop the stone, because I always cut pavilion first. So all you have to do is cut to the point that the center where the table's going to be is flat, where you're going to dop the stone up. Right now I've got a little bitty crack that's right there that needs to go away, and it probably ends right where this little divot comes out. So it's pretty much gone, and I pretty much have an area for the table in the center. So now if I measure to the center of the stone, I'm still just under 9 millimeter. And this direction I'm still over 15, so I've still got quite a bit of material to cut away. And you don't have to get rid of it all. You can do that during the cutting process. I generally just get close, try and make it good and round, so when I stop, it's easier to find the center point. So now I've got a pretty round stone. I've got at least area all the way around the stone, except right there, that will be girdle. So this is probably good enough for a preform. So here's our second stone. This is rhodolite garnet from Tanzania. This one weighs 26 carats. And so the first thing I do is, in determining cut, is try and take its measurements. This is about 14 by a little over 10 millimeters depth, and it's close to 80% depth, and that depth kind of determines what you can cut out of it. This is fairly deep, so we can do a lot of different styles of cutting, whether it be stepped or some types of brilliance, burying. This is pretty much like a square cushion. So it's still to be determined what I'm going to cut out of it, but I'll get rid of a little bit of the excess material, which it's pretty close to a preform now. And again, you don't have to preform like this. It's just really an assist when you go to dop the stone up and get the dop in the center of the stone. So the closer it is visually to what you're going to end up with, the easier it's going to be to get it positioned correctly. And really, this is probably good enough. The stone could be round, could be cushioned, but I think we're going to do a cushion out of this. Okay, here's my two rough preforms, and now we're going to dop these up in preparation for cutting. So there's a few techniques I use. One is to use a millimeter gauge. This one has nice sharp points on it, so it does actually draw good lines. So if you go beyond, you go about 3/4 of the way across, and then you make a line, and then go to the other side, make another line, and do this all the way around the stone, and you'll pretty much find out where the center of your stone is. This works on bigger pieces of material. In this case, I use another technique that I found very effective, and that's using the dops that we dop these up with. So I've got this larger V-dop, and I've put this orthodontic wax in it, or you can use clay. This is available at any drugstore. This is just in there just to hold the stone while I dop it. So you place this and push it into the material, try and center it a little bit. Now I've got a dop that's close to the size of the stone I'm dopping, and I'm going to use it to aid in centering the stone. So now I can push this down on the stone, kind of center it on there, and you'll see this stone is real close to the size of this dop. You want to make sure your dops are not worn away, because during cutting some of them you'll cut into the edge, so you want to make sure it's good and round. But now I can visually find the center of the stone by setting it up on this dop. Make sure that the flat you've cut on top of the stone during preforming is set and flat against the dop, and then just try and center it on this dop. And once you've found that it's fairly well centered, just push it down a little harder into the material so it'll stay, because now you're going to have to change this dop to something smaller, typically half the size. I mean, the bigger it is, the more support you give to the stone, but you can't be too big, because we're not going to glue this area of the piece, which is very supportive but very difficult to remove later with epoxy. I'm just going to glue around the edge of it. So I picked a dop that's about half the size of the stone. And again, the bigger the better, but you've got to glue it and not have glue running over the edge. So now you can also check again with a millimeter gauge and check where the edge of it is, check both sides, just to check, make sure that your first centering was pretty good. And again, just because I've got a flat on this piece, you know, if this dop has to be round again to center the stone, if you're going to use the dop as the support for the millimeter gauge. So we seem pretty close to center, and I found that this technique has worked very well, and if you don't get it centered, you lose a lot of material when you're cutting, so this is very critical that you get this properly centered. So now we're going to glue it up, and I use a 2-part epoxy, and you just mix equal parts. Use a toothpick to mix it. And once you've got it well mixed, now we're going to apply it around the edge of the stone or the dop. You don't want it going over the edge of the stone. This will cause problems later. If it drips over the edge and you cut into the glue, it's going to break that seal. So you want to get as much as possible on the stone without going over the edge of the stone. So once it's on there, I generally kind of rub it into both the stone and the dop. And then manipulate it. It's going to want to drip over the edge, so you can, for a couple of minutes, you sit there and play with it and keep it from going over the edge just by moving it around. You know, you want it to spread out towards the edge of the stone, but just not over the edge. Again, if it drips over the edge and you cut with a diamond lap on it, it'll break that seal, and the worst thing that can possibly happen to you is this comes off the dop. So this glue is going to take 5 minutes before it gets solid at all that you can even consider moving it, but the longer you wait, the better. You're not going to want to cut on this really for 8 hours. I have done it in as short as 2 or 3 hours, but I think you put yourself at risk of the stone breaking loose and not being solidly attached. So if you can wait overnight, it's best. Talking about the glue and it going over the edge, sometimes you'll find that the stone you're cutting is not going to be as big as you expect it to be, and you're going to start running into the glue. So what you're going to want to do, instead of just cutting it on the lap, is take your X-Acto knife and just cut it back a little ways, so you're not cutting into it, because it can cause problems. So wait at least 8 hours if possible before you start cutting on these stones. So we're dopped up now, and I need to wait a little while before I dop up the garnet. But you know, this stone, the citrine being around, you don't have to worry how you put it in the transfer block. But this is going to be a square, so you're going to want to square it up appropriately when you dop it up, so when you put it in the machine, your indexes are correct. So as soon as this is hardened, I'll probably wait till tomorrow, and we'll start cutting on the pavilion of this stone in the next part of how to cut gemstones.